Parshas Shof'tim. This week's Parsha, notably, discusses the obligation to set up a judiciary system and to appoint judges and to adjudicate disputes between people and to bring matters of religious issues before the judges. And then the Parsha describes various prohibitions. Among them, at the beginning, are prohibitions against serving false gods, pagan worship. One verse describes the prohibition of planting an Asherah tree, a tree that was worshipped by the Canaanim, by the Canaanites, as an object of Avodah Zarah, planting it near an altar. And then in Perek Tezayin, Pasuk Chav Beis, that's 16:22, the Torah says, "Don't set up for yourself a slab of stone or a pillar, that the Lord your God despises." And the commentaries explain that a matzeva was an object of pagan worship, notably by the Canaanim, by the Canaanites, and therefore, because it is an object of pagan worship, we are prohibited from doing likewise, of even just setting it up, even if it is, according to most Meforshim, according to most commentaries, l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven, for genuine worship. Now, this is problematic, because we know, for example, going back to the Avos, going back to our forefathers, that they would do just that. In one example is in Bereshis, Genesis, Lamed Hey Yudalid, 35:14. The verse says, "Vayatzev Yaakov matzeva b'makom asher diber ito," and Yaakov set up a matzeva, a pillar, a slab of stone, in the place that he spoke with him, that Hashem spoke with him. So we see that Yaakov engaged in the very activity that the Almighty describes as being hated now in the Torah. So what's the deal with that? Rashi says, he explains on this verse, "Matzeves oven achas lakrivo leha, afilu l'shamayim," a pillar of one stone, one slab, to bring offerings to it, even if it's for the sake of heaven, for God. Asher saneh, that Hashem hates, strong language. Mizbeach avonim u'mizbeach adamot tzivo lasos. The Almighty commanded, if you were going to serve Him through offerings, to do that through an altar of many stones, and to do it, or an altar out of earth. Ve'es zo saneh, but this, meaning the matzeva, he despises. Ki chok hoisa l'kananim, because this was the practice, the law of the Canaanites, that they would serve this slab of stone. Va'af al pi shehoisa ahuvalo bimei ha'avos, and even though it was beloved to him at the time of the forefathers, achshav san'ah, now he despises it. Me'achar shasu'uhu elu chok l'avodah zarah. Once these pagans have made it their ritual for idol worship. So we see something that we see a development even in the attitude of the Almighty towards an object of worship, which is something that might have been acceptable, even laudable, even beloved in previous times, but once it is abused and it comes to be identified as a deviant form of service, it now becomes hated. I'm reminded of the position of the Vilna Gaon about putting flowers. It's a well-established practice to put flowers in the Batei Knesios, in the shuls, for the holiday of Shavuos, which commemorates Revelation. And part of the reason that the authorities say that this is a practice is that the mountain was, Mount Sinai, was verdant and had quite abundant vegetation. So this commemorates the vegetation, the experience of Mount Sinai. And the Vilna Gaon says that it is now prohibited. Why is it prohibited? Because the nations of the world who serve different gods also use flowers. So we see that there are practices which were laudable at one time, are no longer so. Now the Ramban asks a question. He says, wait a second. The pagans who worship Avodah Zarah, worship pagan idol worshippers, also use not only a matzeva, but they also use a Mizbeach, they use an altar. So why stop there? Why prohibit just a Matzeva and not a Mizbeach? And he gives an answer. The Netziv distinguishes between a Mizbeach, an altar, and a Matzeva. He says a Mizbeach is something on which people brought sacrifices to either Hashem, to God, or the Ovdei Avodah Zarah, the pagan worshippers, brought it as a sacrifice to their gods. It was almost a neutral media that could go either way, whereas the Matzeva was in itself an object of worship. Now, lest you think that this is just ancient history, this actually was brought home to me personally and to many others in my class and in my school when I was in high school. My Rabbi, Rav Ahron Soloveichik, was the Rav of the Mizrachi shul on Foster Avenue, 3434 Foster Avenue. And the neighborhood changed, and the people the Mizrachi leadership who owned the building wanted to sell it. And the best offer they got was from a Buddhist group called the Nichiren Soshu. And so Rav Ahron, in inquiring about the nature of this group, discovered that it worships an object called the Dai Goanzan. And it is, he researched this. In those days, there was no Google, but he looked it up in the Encyclopedia Britannica, he told me, and maybe other sources as well. And he discovered that this sect of Buddhism actually worships this object. And it, or some reference to it, is enshrined in every Nichiren Soshu temple. And he ruled that it was prohibited to sell a synagogue to a sect that worshipped Avodah Zarah. It actually became a matter of tremendous controversy. There was a reluctance on the part of the leadership of the Mizrachi at the time to back out of the deal, and Rav Ahron, who was quite fiercely dedicated to observance of halacha, recruited many of his students to actually picket the Mizrachi Center in order to bring notoriety to the cause. So Avodah Zarah is not simply a thing of the past, but it also is manifest currently as well. Now there's another aspect of the effect of time, how it changes perception and perhaps even reality. We see an exhortation, a requirement that when there is a dispute between people or some other matter that requires adjudication, the Torah says, come to the Kohanim, Leviim, and to the judge who will be at that time. And the Gemara and the Midrashim say, what? Could you go to a judge who wasn't at that time? What does it mean, who will be at that time? Of course, you're going to go to whomever is available. You're not going to get in your time machine and travel to a different time. And Rashi here, and also later on in the Parsha, that was 17:10, and also later on in Yud Tes, in Perek Yud Tes, Pasuk Yud Zayin, where it says that you bring a dispute l'fnei haKohanim v'Shof'tim asher yihiyu bayomim hahem. And Rashi says, you might think, in both places, something similar, not identical, but he says, you might think that the current judges just don't stack up to the previous judges, who, in our opinion, would be on the level of Rav Moshe Feinstein. And how could someone get satisfaction or a satisfactory result from someone who is perhaps less qualified, although he may be a judge, he may be a chief judge, but he may not be on the level of those of the previous generation? Or in another context, on the following verse that we quoted, Yiftach was not on the same level as Shmuel, but we say Shmuel Bedoro, Yiftach Bedoro. Whoever is the appointed leader of his generation, then regardless of whether in the book of rankings, if you will, he wouldn't qualify as an all-star of the same level as those previously, nevertheless, we are required to submit to their authority, and we are required to give them the kavod, the honor of the position, regardless of how they rank, relatively speaking. Have a good Shabbos.